In the early hours of September 2nd, 1666, a baker named Thomas Fariner went to sleep in his small house on Pudding Lane, a narrow alley near London Bridge. His oven, which had been busy all day baking ship's biscuit for the Royal Navy, had been raked and damped for the night. Everything seemed ordinary. Everything seemed safe. By the time dawn broke, his house was gone. His neighbourhood was gone. And the city that had stood for over 1,000 years was being consumed by a fire that would burn for 4 days and nights, destroying nearly everything in its path. When the flames finally died, the London that had existed since Roman times had vanished, and yet somehow the city survived. Not just survived, it was reborn. This is the story of how London faced annihilation and emerged from the ashes to become the greatest city in the world. To understand why the fire spread with such terrifying speed, you must first understand what London looked like in 1666. The city that burned was not the London of grand stone buildings and wide avenues that we know today. It was a medieval labyrinth, a dense tangle of narrow lanes and overhanging timber houses that had grown organically over centuries, with little planning and even less regard for safety. The streets were so narrow that neighbours on opposite sides could lean out their upper windows and shake hands. Buildings jutted outward as they rose, blocking sunlight at street level, creating dark canyons of wood and pitch and thatch. Every surface was combustible. The houses were timber-framed, their walls often filled with wattle and daub, their roofs a patchwork of wooden shingles and straw. Warehouses along the river bulged with tar, oil, hemp and coal. The whole city was, in essence, a fuel depot waiting for a spark. And that summer had been brutally dry. England had experienced weeks of baking heat with almost no rain. The wooden structures of London had been desiccated, transformed into perfect kindling. The Thames itself was running low. When the spark finally came, it found a city that was ready to burn. The spark came from Fariner's bakery sometime after midnight. The exact cause remains uncertain. Fariner himself swore until his dying day that he had properly extinguished his ovens. But somehow, in the darkness of that Sunday morning, embers found fuel. By 1 o'clock in the morning, the house was ablaze. Fariner woke to smoke and flames. He managed to escape with his daughter and a servant by climbing out an upstairs window and crossing to a neighbour's roof. His maidservant, too frightened to make the leap, became the fire's first victim, though remarkably, she would be one of very few confirmed deaths. The fire spread quickly to neighbouring buildings. The alarm was raised, church bells began to ring, and here, at the very beginning, we encounter the first of many failures that would transform a contained house fire into a citywide catastrophe. The Lord Mayor of London, Sir Thomas Bloodworth, was roused from his bed and brought to see the blaze. What he saw did not impress him. Fires were common in London. They broke out regularly and were usually contained. Bloodworth surveyed the scene, watched the flames licking at the wooden houses, and reportedly dismissed the emergency with contempt. A woman might put it out, he said, and went back to bed. It was a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The problem was not arrogance alone, though there was plenty of that. The problem was that the standard method for fighting fires in the 17th century was demolition. You stopped a fire by pulling down houses in its path, creating gaps too wide for the flames to jump. But pulling down houses required authorization. It destroyed property. It invited lawsuits. Bloodworth, a man of limited imagination and considerable caution, was reluctant to order the destruction of buildings when the fire still seemed manageable. By the time he realized his mistake, it was far too late. The fire moved faster than anyone anticipated. Pushed by a strong easterly wind, it raced through the tightly packed streets, leaping from rooftop to rooftop, consuming whole blocks in minutes. The warehouses near the river, packed with combustible goods, erupted in spectacular blazes that sent pillars of flame roaring into the sky. People woke to find the fire already upon them. They grabbed what they could carry and fled, clogging the narrow streets, blocking the primitive fire engines that were trying to reach the blaze. Chaos compounded chaos. By Sunday afternoon, the fire had spread along Thames Street, the main commercial artery running parallel to the river. It was devouring the heart of London's trade, the warehouses and shops that held the wealth of the nation. People tried to save their goods by throwing them into the river or loading them onto boats, but there were not enough boats, and the confusion on the waterfront was indescribable. Samuel Pepys, the naval administrator whose diary provides our most vivid account of the disaster, watched from the Tower of London as the fire advanced. Everyone endeavouring to remove their goods, he wrote, and flinging them into the river or bringing them into lighters that lay off. Poor people staying in their houses as long as till the very fire touched them, and then running into boats or clambering from one pair of stairs by the waterside to another. What strikes modern readers about Pepys's account is the strange mixture of horror and domesticity. Even as the city burned, ordinary concerns persisted. Pepys worried about his wine cellar. He arranged for a cart to carry his most valuable possessions to safety. Most famously, he buried his Parmesan cheese in his garden to protect it from the flames. There is something deeply human about this, the mind refusing to accept the scale of catastrophe, focusing instead on small, manageable problems. The cheese could be saved, the cheese could be buried. The city itself was another matter. By Monday, the fire was completely out of control. It had jumped the gap where the Roman wall had once stood and was advancing into the city proper. The narrow medieval streets acted as chimneys, channeling the superheated air and driving the flames forward with terrible speed. The fire was so intense that it created its own weather, a vortex of updrafts that pulled in fresh air at ground level, feeding the conflagration with unlimited oxygen. Contemporary accounts describe a sound like thunder, a continuous roar that could be heard for miles. The heat was so fierce that the lead roof of St. Paul's Cathedral began to melt, running in streams down the walls and into the streets. It was at this point that King Charles II finally took personal command of the firefighting efforts. Charles was no stranger to disaster. He had spent years in exile during the Civil War and interregnum, had seen his father executed, had lived in poverty in foreign courts. He understood crisis, and unlike his Lord Mayor, he was willing to make hard decisions. Charles rode through the burning streets, shouting orders, directing the creation of fire breaks, and crucially, overriding the property concerns that had paralysed Bloodworth. The king personally handed out gold coins to the exhausted men pulling down buildings, both as reward and motivation. His brother James, Duke of York, commanded the firefighting operations on the ground, working alongside common labourers, his face blackened with soot. The royal presence galvanised the effort, but even with the king's authority behind them, the firefighters were losing ground. Monday night was the nadir. The fire reached Cheapside, the widest street in the city, and barely paused before continuing its advance. It consumed Guildhall, the seat of city government, whose medieval Great Hall somehow survived even as its surroundings were destroyed. It reached the precincts of St. Paul's Cathedral, where booksellers had stored their stock in the supposedly fireproof stone crypt. The books caught fire. The cathedral, already in poor repair, after years of neglect during the Puritan Commonwealth, was utterly destroyed. Its massive roof collapsed inward, sending a plume of sparks and smoke visible for 50 miles. The destruction of St. Paul's was more than material loss. It was the destruction of a symbol, the spiritual heart of the city. Watching it burn, Londoners must have wondered if their city could possibly recover. The turning point came on Tuesday. The wind finally began to shift and die down. More importantly, the systematic creation of fire breaks was starting to work. Gunpowder was used to blow up buildings in the fire's path, creating gaps too wide to jump. The garrisons at the Tower of London, working under the direction of the Duke of York, managed to save the fortress by demolishing the surrounding houses. Similar efforts protected the Temple and parts of the Western City. By Tuesday evening, the worst was over. By Wednesday, the fire had been contained, though isolated pockets would continue to smoulder for days. Pepys walked through the ruins on Thursday, still finding hot ground beneath his feet. still seeing smoke rising from cellars. The scale of destruction was almost incomprehensible. The fire had consumed over 13,000 houses, 87 parish churches, and most of the public buildings within the city walls. An estimated 100,000 people had been made homeless. The financial loss was staggering, perhaps £10 million at contemporary values, a sum that represented a significant fraction of England's entire annual economic output. The medieval city of London, the city of Chaucer and Dick Whittington, the city that had survived plague and civil war and foreign invasion, had essentially ceased to exist, and yet remarkably, the human cost was minimal. The official death toll was astonishingly low, only 6 verified deaths, though the true number was certainly higher. Many of the poor, whose deaths would not have been recorded, likely perished unnoticed. Bodies may have been cremated so completely that no trace remained. But even accounting for these uncertainties, the Great Fire was not primarily a killer of people. It was a destroyer of property, of history, of the physical fabric of urban life. The people themselves, by and large, escaped. They escaped to the fields beyond the city walls, to Moorfields and Finsbury, where tent cities sprang up almost overnight. They escaped to the river, to boats and barges, and anything that would float. They escaped to the suburbs, to Southwark across the bridge, and to Westminster to the west. They carried with them what they could save: furniture, clothes, business records, the Parmesan cheese buried in Samuel Pepys's garden. They watched their city burn, and then they began to rebuild it. The rebuilding of London is one of the great stories of urban planning, though it is often misremembered. The popular narrative holds that Christopher Wren designed a grand new city of wide avenues and classical vistas, but was thwarted by greedy property owners who insisted on rebuilding along the old medieval street plan. The truth is more complicated. Wren did produce a plan, as did several other architects, and these plans were indeed rejected. But the rejection came not from greed so much as from practical necessity. The boundaries of thousands of properties were encoded in legal documents and in the memories of their owners. To impose a new street plan would have required untangling centuries of property law, compensating thousands of displaced owners, and delaying reconstruction for years while the legal framework was established. London needed to rebuild quickly. Its commerce needed to resume. Its people needed homes. The old street plan, for all its faults, allowed this to happen. But if the streets remained mostly the same, almost everything else changed. New regulations mandated brick and stone construction in place of timber. Overhanging upper stories were banned. Streets were widened where possible. A new system of building standards established minimum requirements for structural safety. The medieval tinderbox was replaced by a more fire-resistant city, one that would never again be vulnerable to the kind of catastrophic conflagration that had just destroyed it. The transformation took decades. St. Paul's Cathedral was not completed until 1711, 45 years after the fire, but the city that emerged was recognisably modern in ways its predecessor had not been. There is a monument to the Great Fire that still stands in London today, a simple column of Portland stone near the spot where the fire began. For centuries its base bore an inscription blaming the fire on Catholic conspirators, a claim for which there was never any evidence but which reflected the paranoid politics of the time. The inscription was eventually removed. The monument remains, a reminder of destruction and survival, of the fragility of human constructions and the resilience of human communities. The Great Fire of London was not the end of the city, it was a transformation. The cramped medieval warren that burned in 1666 was replaced by a more spacious, more orderly, more fireproof metropolis. The catastrophe accelerated changes that might otherwise have taken generations. It cleared away the old and made space for the new. Within a few decades, London was larger and more prosperous than it had been before the fire. By the 18th century, it was the largest city in Europe, the capital of a growing empire, the centre of global trade and finance. The fire had not destroyed London, It had forced London to become something greater. There is a lesson here, though perhaps not the one we expect. Disasters do not simply happen to cities. Cities respond to disasters, and the nature of that response shapes everything that follows. The Great Fire was devastating, but it was also an opportunity, seized however imperfectly, to build something better. The new London was safer, more sanitary, better organised. The catastrophe became a catalyst for improvement. This is not inevitable. Disasters can just as easily lead to decline, to abandonment, to permanent diminishment. What made the difference in London was human agency, the decision, made by thousands of individuals and embodied in new laws and new building practices, to rebuild better than before. We still face fires, we still face disasters of all kinds, floods, earthquakes, pandemics, and catastrophes we cannot yet imagine. What the Great Fire teaches us is that survival is not passive. It is not simply enduring the disaster and waiting for it to pass. Survival is active. It is the choice to rebuild, to learn, to adapt. It is the recognition that the city is not its buildings, but its people, and that people can always start again. Anyway, I'm Jack, watching the past so we can understand the present, and together we keep history reborn. I'll see you in the next era.